The legend spoke of a cave, hidden deep within the tangled woods of Black Hollow. Locals called it the cave that feeds on fear, a place so cursed and vile that even the bravest hunters refused to venture near it. Some claimed it was alive, breathing with malice, its dark maw waiting to swallow anyone foolish enough to step inside. Others swore they'd heard screams echoing from its depths, screams that didn't belong to any man or beast. One stormy evening, 3 friends, Evan, Lucas, and Chloe, arrived in the nearby village. They were amateur explorers, driven by arrogance and the thrill of defying danger. Each carried a backpack stuffed with flashlights, ropes, and cameras, intent on documenting their discovery for fame. The villagers warned them to stay away, their faces pale as if remembering some unspoken horror. "Stay out of that cave," one old woman hissed, her trembling hands clutching a rosary. "Once you enter, you won't come back the same, if you come back at all." Evan laughed, brushing her off. "It's just an old story. We'll be fine." That night, under a sky bruised by rolling thunder and jagged lightning, the trio reached the entrance of the cave. The surrounding air was unnaturally cold, the ground slick with mud that seemed to pull at their boots. A faint, almost imperceptible hum emanated from the darkness, sending shivers up Chloe's spine. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just the wind," Lucas replied, though his shaky voice betrayed his unease. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the oppressive blackness. The cave walls were damp and streaked with what looked like claw marks, jagged and deep, as if gouged by something enormous. The air smelled of iron, damp earth, and something else, a putrid, coppery tang that clung to their throats. "Is that blood?" Chloe asked, pointing to a dark stain smeared across the wall. Evan crouched to touch it, rubbing the substance between his fingers. "It's wet," he muttered, his cocky demeanor faltering. As they ventured deeper, the cave seemed to shift around them. Shadows danced where there was no light, and the walls appeared to pulse as though alive. The hum grew louder, morphing into whispers that seemed to come from every direction. "What the hell is that?" Lucas spun around, shining his flashlight wildly. The beam caught something, just for a second. A pale, humanoid figure with hollow eyes and a gaping, toothless mouth. It melted into the darkness before they could process what they'd seen. "Let's turn back," Chloe begged, her breath quickening. "This place isn't right." Evan shook his head, but even he looked shaken. "We've come this far. We'll just go a little deeper." The whispers became clearer now, like a chorus of voices chanting in an unknown language. The ground beneath them grew uneven, sticky with a substance that clung to their boots like tar. Lucas stumbled, his flashlight clattering to the ground. When he bent to retrieve it, his hand touched something cold and slimy. He recoiled, bringing the flashlight back up to reveal a severed hand, its fingers curled as if frozen mid-scream. "Oh my God!" he yelled, staggering back. Before anyone could react, a deafening shriek tore through the cave, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. It was inhuman, a guttural wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls trembled, cracks forming as if the cave itself was screaming with rage. "Run!" Evan shouted, grabbing Chloe's arm. They sprinted back the way they came, or at least, they thought they did. The cave twisted and turned, passages appearing where none had been before. The exit was gone, swallowed by the living labyrinth. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking, cruel, and filled with malice. Suddenly, Lucas stopped, his eyes wide and unfocused. "They are here," he mumbled, his voice hollow. "They're all here." "Who's here?" Chloe screamed, shaking him. He pointed ahead. The beam of Evan's flashlight illuminated a grotesque scene. A mass of bodies fused into the walls, their faces frozen in eternal agony. Eyes blinked in sockets that should no longer function, mouths opened and closed in silent screams. And then, one of the faces turned to look directly at them. Chloe's flashlight flickered, and at that moment of darkness, something wet and heavy brushed against her leg. "Move!" Evan yelled, pulling her forward. But Lucas didn't follow. He stood frozen, staring into the black abyss ahead. "They're calling me," he whispered, and before they could stop him, he walked into the darkness, vanishing as if swallowed whole. His screams followed seconds later, gurgling and wet, until they too were cut off. Evan and Chloe didn't dare stop. Their breaths came in ragged gasps as they stumbled deeper into the cave, their only guide the faint glow of their weakening flashlights. The air grew colder, biting at their skin, while the hum of whispers and laughter grew louder, reverberating through the walls like a living, mocking heartbeat. "Lucas!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. But there was no reply, only the sound of something wet dragging itself across the cavern floor behind them. Evan grabbed her wrist and pulled her forward. "We can't stop. We'll end up like him if we do." The path twisted again, narrowing to the point where they had to squeeze through jagged rock formations that seemed to tear at their clothes and flesh. Every surface was slick, not just with water, but with a viscous, black substance that pulsed faintly under their touch. The smell of decay grew overpowering, and with it came the faint sound of dripping, as though the cave itself was bleeding. Ahead, the passage opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling so high their flashlights couldn't reach it. The floor was covered in a thick, crimson liquid that reeked of iron. In the center of the chamber stood a grotesque altar, carved from bone and sinew, pulsating with a sickly, greenish light. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Chloe clutched Evan's arm. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the altar. "But it's wrong. We need to get out of here." As they turned to leave, the liquid beneath their feet began to ripple. Shapes emerged from the blood-like pool, twisted, humanoid figures with eyeless faces and limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their movements were jerky, as if they were being controlled by unseen strings. They crawled toward Evan and Chloe with unnatural speed, their mouths opening wide to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. "Run!" Evan yelled, yanking Chloe away. They sprinted toward the nearest tunnel, but the creatures followed, their guttural growls echoing through the cave. Chloe stumbled, her foot caught in a root-like tendril that slithered up from the ground. She screamed as it wrapped around her ankle, pulling her down. Evan turned back, slamming the butt of his flashlight into the tendril until it released her. The creature closest to them lunged, its clawed hand swiping inches from Evan's face as he hauled Chloe to her feet. They ran blindly, the tunnels closing in around them, the walls now pulsating as if alive. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct. "Stay! Join us! Feed the cave!" The voice was everywhere, echoing in their heads and vibrating in their bones. Chloe clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop! Please! Make it stop!" Evan grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Focus! We are getting out of here. We have to keep moving." But the cave wasn't finished with them. The ground beneath them gave way, sending them tumbling into a pit. They landed with a bone-jarring thud on a slick, spongy surface. Evan groaned, struggling to his feet, and shone his flashlight around. The pit was lined with flesh-like walls that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. Embedded in the walls were faces, hundreds of them, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. Some of the faces were decayed, others disturbingly fresh, their eyes rolling to follow Evan and Chloe as they moved. Chloe gagged, clutching her stomach. What is this place?" Evan didn't answer. His flashlight beam fell on something in the corner of the pit, a bundle of clothing he recognized immediately. It was Lucas's jacket, torn and soaked in blood. Next to it was a trail of shredded flesh leading into a narrow tunnel. "He's still alive," Evan said, though his voice was hollow, as if trying to convince himself. Chloe shook her head violently. No, we have to leave. He's gone, Evan. He's gone." But Evan was already moving, crawling into the tunnel. "We can't just leave him. He's our friend." Reluctantly, Chloe followed, her breathing shallow as the tunnel closed in around them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The walls began to drip with the same black, tar-like substance, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. Ahead, a faint light flickered, a sickly green glow that seemed to pulsate in time with the whispers. As they crawled closer, The tunnel opened into another chamber. This one was smaller but no less horrifying. In the center was Lucas, suspended in midair by tendrils of black, fleshy material that burrowed into his skin. His head lolled to the side, his eyes lifeless, yet his lips moved, whispering the same chant that filled the cave. "Lucas!" Evan shouted, rushing forward. Lucas's head snapped up, and his eyes locked onto Evan. But they weren't Lucas's eyes anymore. They were black voids, filled with malice. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come back," he rasped, his voice layered with 1,000 others. The tendrils holding him shuddered, and the entire chamber trembled. The walls began to close in, the fleshy material reaching for Evan and Chloe like grasping hands. "Run!" Chloe screamed, pulling at Evan. But Lucas, or whatever had taken over his body, let out a blood-curdling shriek, and the tendrils shot forward, wrapping around Evan's legs. Chloe grabbed his arm, pulling with all her strength, but the tendrils were too strong. Evan's screams echoed through the chamber as he was dragged toward the pulsating mass in the center. Chloe hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave you," she sobbed. Evan looked at her, his face twisted in agony. "Go! Save yourself!" With a final, heart-wrenching sob, Chloe turned and fled, the whispers chasing her as the walls seemed to collapse around her. The last thing she heard was Evan's scream, abruptly cut off, followed by the laughter of the cave itself. Chloe ran blindly through the labyrinth of twisting tunnels, her breath ragged, her tears mixing with the blood and sweat on her face. Every step was agony, her legs trembling, her body screaming for rest, but she couldn't stop. The cave was alive now, pulsing and writhing as though mocking her escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices dripping with malice. "You cannot leave. You belong to us now." The flashlight in a trembling hand flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the flesh-like walls. Shapes moved just beyond the edges of her light, elongated, grotesque figures with empty eye sockets and clawed hands. They crawled closer with every passing second, their guttural growls growing louder. Chloe tripped over a jagged root that erupted from the ground like a skeletal hand. She hit the ground hard, her flashlight clattering away and plunging her into near-total darkness. She scrambled to her knees, frantically reaching for the light, but her fingers brushed against something cold and slimy instead. A face. It was Lucas's, or what was left of it, his lifeless, eyeless head staring up at her, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Chloe shrieked and recoiled, her hand finding the flashlight at last. She turned it on, the beam cutting through the dark just as one of the creatures lunged at her. It missed by inches, its claws raking the air where her head had been moments before. Chloe scrambled to her feet and bolted down the nearest tunnel, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind her. Her chest burned, and her vision blurred with tears. But she pushed forward, driven by sheer terror. The tunnel began to slope upward, and for the first time, Chloe dared to hope. The air grew colder, fresher, and she could see a faint glimmer of light ahead. The exit. It had to be. She poured every ounce of her strength into reaching it, her legs screaming in protest. But as she neared the light, the cave began to shake violently. The walls closed in, writhing and pulsing, trying to trap her. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the ground beneath her feet split open. From the fissure emerged a massive, grotesque figure, a monstrous amalgamation of flesh, bone, and countless writhing faces. Its hollow eyes locked onto her, and its many mouths spoke as one. "You cannot escape. You are part of us," Chloe screamed and threw herself toward the light. The creature's massive hand, a grotesque mass of claws and tendrils, swiped at her, ripping into her backpack and tearing it away. She fell forward, tumbling out of the cave and into the cold, damp forest. The roar of the cave abruptly stopped. Chloe lay on the ground, panting and trembling, her body racked with sobs. The entrance to the cave was gone. No gaping maw, no pulsating walls. Just a smooth, unbroken rock face covered in moss. For a long time, she didn't move. She stared at the rock, waiting for it to reopen, for the nightmare to drag her back inside. But the forest remained silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. She was alive. She had escaped. Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had returned to the city, but life felt off. The memories of the cave haunted her every waking moment. Evan's screams, Lucas's lifeless body, the whispers. She dreamed of them every night, and when she woke, she could swear she still heard the faint hum of the cave in the distance. Her friends were gone. The world had moved on, but Chloe couldn't. Her reflection in the mirror looked different. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes seemed to sink further into their sockets each day. And then there were the whispers, faint at first, like a distant hum, but growing louder with each passing week. One evening, as she sat in a dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the TV, the whispers returned, clearer than ever. "Come back. It's not over." She froze, the remote falling from her hand. Her apartment door creaked open slowly, though she knew she had locked it. The lights flickered, and the air grew cold, filled with a metallic stench of blood. Chloe rose to her feet, trembling, her eyes fixed on the door. A shadow moved in the hallway beyond. A familiar figure stepped into the light. Evan. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and black as the void, but his twisted smile was unmistakable. "Chloe," he rasped, his voice layered with 1,000 others. "It's time to come home." Behind him, the walls of her apartment began to melt, transforming into the fleshy, pulsating walls of the cave. The whispers grew deafening, and Chloe's screams were swallowed by the endless darkness.